You know, we've been covering the so-called doomsday cult mom, Lori Vallow-Daybell, since the beginning of the year. This is a story that has evolved. We've seen all the different layers, but throughout it all is Lori Vallow-Daybell. Who exactly is this woman, and why is she doing the things that she's doing? Why is she acting and reacting the way she is? And a lot of people have different theories, but now she's a criminal defendant in a case that can put her away in prison for a long time. She's also the subject of an investigation into at least one murder case, probably two, perhaps three. The bottom line, once you are a criminal defendant, your state of mind, how your mind is working becomes extremely relevant. And if someone is off the rails and someone is suffering from mental illness and is not the person that they once were, every criminal defense attorney is going to take a look at that and evaluate it and say, well, you know, is this an insanity case? The problem for Lori Vallow-Daybell is she's charged in Idaho, and Idaho doesn't have an insanity defense. Chanley Painter takes a closer look tonight.
She's lost her mind. She thinks she's a resurrected being and a god.
This is Lori Vallow-Daybell's former husband, Charles Vallow, captured on police body cam expressing concern about his wife's mental health.
Her religious stuff has gone way off the deep end.
The issue was also raised by her former best friend, Melanie Gibb.
There comes a point where you got to wake up and realize there's some either mental illness there, some evil influences there.
In court documents, Gibb said Lori told her that first, Charles and then the children had been taken over by dark spirits. And here, Charles tells police his wife is threatening him.
I don't know who you are, what you did with Charles, but I can murder you now with my powers.
Less than a year after Charles Vallow's complaints, he and the children would all be dead.
So when they started to talk about zombies, you weren't really thinking anything more of it?
No, because they never talked about killing anyone. They would always talk about praying and hoping that the spirits would leave the bodies.
Not a lot of people that are mentally competent have a lot of stock in zombies being a real concept.
Lori's statements could be the basis of an insanity defense, but not in Idaho, where the law does not give defendants the option to plead insanity.
An insanity defense in the traditional way basically meant you could be found not guilty if you had a mental health condition.
In fact, the state is one of only 4 in the United States without an insanity plea.
Well, way back when I was Attorney General of Idaho in the 1980s, we eliminated the insanity defense. We were having in Idaho courts an abuse of the insanity defense, in my opinion, in that it was being invoked in everything from traffic tickets and drunk driving cases.
But Lori's mental health could still play a role in her defense.
Simply asked the jury to decide, did the defendant have the capacity to commit the mental element? Psychiatric testimony is still permitted, but it's only on that narrow range of issues.
Under Idaho law, mental fitness can be addressed in a couple of ways. First, it can come up before a trial, where the court would determine whether the defendant is competent to stand trial.
If there is a mental health issue that's sufficient to prevent the defendant from understanding what's going on, a timeout will be had until the defendant is cured.
Second, the issue of mental capacity can also be brought up during the trial by the jury determining whether or not the defendant at the time of the crime was able to form the intent required.
With respect to the cases involving Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell, most of those charges are essentially general intent crimes, which means all the state has to prove from an intent point of view is that they intended the actions that they are charged with doing. So the state doesn't have a real tall hill to climb in terms of proving their intent to conceal the bodies. Where it gets more difficult for the state is if you have a specific intent crime.
Meaning any potential mental illness defense of the Daybells would really only come into play if murder charges were filed against them.
It's the state's burden of proof to prove the premeditation and deliberation, and that you can argue from, demonstrate that these people didn't know right from wrong or were not in touch with reality.
Still, according to experts, it is a very difficult defense to make in Idaho.
It is so onerous that it's almost never succeeds. So even if you thought, for example, that the being in front of you was a zombie or an alien, and you were doing this because you needed to protect the world, let's say, wouldn't matter because you thought about it ahead of time, you planned out what you're going to do, and you knew that your action could result in serious harm or death. So under Idaho statute, that could be sufficient elements to convict you of first-degree murder.
Sounds like bad news for Lori Vallow-Daybell and her defense team. At least one less defense available if and when she's charged with murder. Let's bring in our team of legal journalists with us tonight, folks. Legal correspondent Chanley Painter, Court TV anchor Julie Grant, Ted Rowlands, Court TV anchor, and special contributor Ashley Banfield here. Chanley, so how does this work? It seems from your piece that while you don't have the traditional insanity plea, there is some language that's similar, but it's almost impossible to get there because you're not asking the jury, hey, you know, this person really didn't know right from wrong. It's much more subtle and seems much more difficult for the defense to use this as any sort of a defense.
Exactly right. And even when charged with murder in the first degree, really the balance still weighs in the favor of the prosecution, just like the expert said in our story. You know, it doesn't matter if you thought whoever you killed was a zombie or an alien or whatever. If you planned it out, you premeditated, you had forethought, and you did it, that's still first-degree murder in the state of Idaho. It's very difficult, and as the experts say, rarely successful defense, and it's a very limited question. Idaho did this in 1982, and basically the defense really only can attack that mental element of whatever offense the defendant is charged with, and still it comes down to what the jury thinks or what the jury believes. In Idaho, I did some legal research because general intent crimes are pretty much easy. You can't use any sort of mental excuse for that. And there are a couple of ways for a prosecutor there to still potentially get a life sentence out of crimes without going to a specific intent crime, maybe to strategically avoid any of the defense delusions of divinity or the zombies that are so wrapped up in the Lori Vallow-Daybell case, to really prevent them from using that as an excuse, if you will. And that would be possibly conspiracy to commit murder, has the same sentence as first-degree murder, but really all the prosecutor would have to prove is the agreement and an overt act, which can be done through the conduct of the parties. And then also, of course, we know felony murder. If you can prove the underlying felony, if it's a general intent felony, that gets you to lead to a death. That would be felony murder, life in prison, Vinny.
Yeah, Ashley, as I look at this, and you know, in a traditional sense, you know, you talk about a mom and her kids, and you think, well, you know, maybe there is something mentally going on. People commented that she changed. What do you think it? Do you think it was what we generally call insanity in legal terms? What was going on with her? That she really didn't think she was doing anything wrong here?
Look, I think she lost her mind. That's for sure. But if there's one thing in the business of legal journalism that I come across all the time, it's the questions that people have about the insanity defense. They think that you can raise it all the time and that it's raised all the time. And the truth about it is it's only raised in 1% of the cases out there. And then it only prevails typically in around 1% of those. So it is not a vastly used tool, and it is really not a tool that is easy in which to prevail. And I also find what people ask all the time is, if you display the slightest amount of lunacy, then that should probably allow you to invoke the insanity defense. And I think most lay folks out there don't realize you can be crazy, but not insane, not legally insane. It's just too difficult. I think with Lori, and I should just say that means two things. Did you understand the nature and consequences of your actions? And did you know right from wrong? It's very simple. So if you're crazy, but you know what you're doing is bad and you hide it, forget about the insanity defense in most states. You're pretty much out of luck. But with Lori Vallow and the whole notion that Idaho won't allow her to invoke it anyway. I do think that, and this gets into the weeds, which I think you all are much better suited for, is that it does sort of bring up this diminished capacity, that I think she was brainwashed. I think she was sort of Patty Hursted a little bit. And I think she was certainly under the influence of somebody extremely controlling. Whether the jury would buy it is a whole other issue. And again, juries are made up of people, real people, hairdressers and mailmen and mechanics and, doctors. And they all have guts, and they usually go with them.
Julie Grant, do you think we'll see anything along these lines in any of Lori Vallow's trials?
It's funny. I've thought a lot about that question, Vinny, and I think it's possible, but to me, I think the more viable defense is they call it the Saudi defense. Some other dude did it. In this case, that other dude is Alex Cox, who's dead, can't testify against them. I think we're going to see more finger pointing, because we know after these children vanished and everyone was scrambling to find those beautiful kids, Mr. and Mrs. Doomsday were off in Hawaii playing the ukulele and dancing on the beach and having a great time. I mean, that behavior doesn't really seem legally insane to me. It seems more like sociopathic behavior. And as Ashley pointed out, in the criminal justice system, if you're a sociopath, that's just too bad. The law doesn't feel bad for you. We go back to really the fundamentals of criminal law when we're talking the insanity defense. Fundamentally, you have the mens rea and the actus reus, and they have to marry in order to have the commission of the crime, right? The guilty mind and the guilty act. And with insanity, there's a problem establishing the guilty mind, but that doesn't absolve someone of criminal liability. And here, I think it's going to be far too much of a stretch, especially the way Idaho law is constructed. I think finger pointing is what we're going to see at trial, Vinny.
Ted, Larry and Kay Woodcock, I thought, explained it well. I mean, it kind of stuck with me when they said that, she was a loving mother, and we loved her. And then something changed. What do you think was going on? I know it's after she met Chad, but what was it? Like, how do we explain this complete change from being a loving mother, someone who the grandparents entrusted JJ with, to someone who's accused of doing what she did?
She went off the deep end. I mean, to me, mental illness is going to be all over this defense. If I were her defense attorney, I would be bringing it up subtly throughout. She was brainwashed by Chad Daybell. Alex Cox was also involved, but she didn't kill anybody. She didn't even know what was going on. She just trusted him, that they were zombies and everything was being taken care of. She went from loving mother to devout follower of this nutbag Daybell, and she was brainwashed. That's what I would, it's going to be all over this trial. I guarantee it. She's going to turn on Chad and her brother Alex. And her mental illness will have to be evaluated by jurors. Not, is this a mental illness defense, but how does it play into her culpability? It's going to be part of this, guaranteed.
Chanley, she had a medical exam, didn't she, back in 2019?
She did. January 31st, 2019, it was an involuntary medical exam that was requested by her then husband, Charles Vallow. We saw body cam of him talking about she's gone off the deep end. Well, this mental exam was that same day. Vinny, she passed with flying colors. They didn't commit her. And so the question now is how maybe that would be used against her or even for her in a trial. Of course, the prosecution can attempt to use it, especially if the defense opens the door of mental issues on behalf of Lori Vallow. Of course, defense would have many objections, including hearsay, but it definitely is relevant to the psychologist that the defense or the expert the defense would bring in to attack that mental element. It may even be in her favor to show, look, she had a history of some of these issues, and so therefore she wasn't in her right mind for this crime.
Fascinating. And Ashley, I know at the top of the next hour, we're going to take a look at some of the other cases involving that mental element, insanity pleas, to give folks a little bit of perspective and historical perspective on the issue. So we'll talk about that.